KnockBack, the retro and nostalgia podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support our show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to KnockBack. My name... Oh, look at this. The camera's a little tilted here. I'm going to fix that right on the fly. My name is Colin Moriarty. I'm joined, as always, by my brother, Dagan Moriarty. Dagan, how are you today, my friend?
Never mind the fine-tuning.
Yeah.
Technical difficulties. I like it.
Yeah.
I like it, my friend.
What's going on?
You'll appreciate this. I was just laughing because I was driving Lilia, your 16-year-old niece, and her friend into town to go grab breakfast and Starbucks and meet friends and go hang out and stuff. And they were commiserating over their school schedules, which they got. They go back. They're not back yet. Helene's back. Helene, the teacher, is back in the building. The kids go back Tuesday, day after late, which is late for us. So they got another week left, but they're commiserating over their schedules and everything like that. And this is literally what they're saying. Her friend's like, I can't believe this. Julia Jelly, Floppy Fish, and Nikki the nepotism baby are all in my English class. And then Lilia responds with, I can't believe Timmy Tugboat and Billy Backpacks is in my social. I'm like, who the hell is in my car right now? The Lucchese crime family? Nobody has a normal name. I was I was literally
Put
looking
him in the
around
bathroom.
like,
Yeah.
Nobody has, and it's like it gets down to like, oh, which Julia Jam or Julia Jelly? Like it's like that. It's like, does anybody just have a name?
That's awesome. They're all like really into The Sopranos. That really caught.
I don't know what it is.
That really caught it. Him, big pussy.
You would see these kids and you would think, it doesn't sound like this should be The Godfather. It doesn't. They don't have that appearance, but that's how they talk.
Indeed.
About everybody,
Indeed,
right?
Indeed.
So I'll keep you guys posted because I want to know. They must have a roster of everybody. You remember? I was telling Lilia, because like I don't know why there's a bunch of wise guys in my car right now, but I was telling her that Dana dated a kid that was nicknamed Teddy Graham, and he really did look like a Teddy Graham, like the cookie.
like the cookie. Yeah,
somehow he really did. Yeah. Like the nickname fit. So it did exist, but not everybody had a nickname back then. I felt like nicknames were special. Now everybody's got some sort of handle that's not their actual name, at least in my daughter's sphere, right? But I was like, Colin will appreciate this because it sounds like I'm listening to Goodfellas right now.
It's funny because you and Allie still call me C very often, which is from The Bronx Tale, of course, which we have to do on the show at some point. But today,
definitely.
Today we do trading cards, collectible cards, collecting cards. I thought this was an interesting topic. We were going to do Halo 3 immediately. We need a little bit more time for that. So we needed an interstitial, and I was going through your list that you sent, and I was like, yeah, this is an interesting one. It forced me to sit down and think, and it should be an easier and breezier one, but I have no idea where you are with this stuff. I have 6 different things to talk about here on my list, but and some of them were really major parts of my life and some of them were really minor parts of my life. But what made you want to talk about this topic or add it to your list? I really don't know what your history is with this. I know your history with toys pretty deeply, but not with cards, your sports cards, your collectible cards. And obviously collectible cards became a pretty big thing in the 70s, but really in the 80s with licensed things. And that's where I think it probably must have started. Star Wars had like an old card set, I think in the 80s, and the garbage Pail Kids and shit like that. So there was something, people were collecting stickers. Remember that? You had like sticker books, and it was pretty cool. I had a sticker book for a little while. I don't know what happened to any of this stuff. Things that I know I had at some point that are just gone, including one of the things that I'm going to talk about here. But talk to me a little bit about the impetus of this topic.
Well, you know what's interesting about that? Mom and Dad weren't notorious for necessarily throwing things out. They did tend to save things. We even talk about that they saved our old first grade notebooks and art projects.
I have all that stuff of my stuff.
Yeah, and they, like the little macaroni art we made and everything. Like they were pretty mindful about saving things. Where I remember Mom growing up, it was always the horror story because Mom lived with not only her parents but her grandparents, her maternal grandparents, and Granny, her grandma, threw everything out. Like when the statute of limitations had passed, or at least she believed that you didn't need it anymore, it was just like gone. So by the time mom was like 16 and she was starting to get nostalgic about her toys, they were out. Like Granny already threw them out like 4 years prior. Like they just had to go type of thing.
It's kind of how like it's kind of like how dad threw out my computers from my childhood. I went downstairs when in my like late 20s in his house. I'm like, yeah, he's like, what are you looking for? I'm like, oh, I'm looking for like my towers, you know, from like my high school tower and my middle. And he's like, oh, I threw those out. I'm like, oh, great, Dad. There's probably like all my schoolwork, like funny ass things on there you just destroyed. But I understand the obsession of throwing things out. I love throwing things out too. So.
Yeah, it's a tidying thing and maybe a little bit of an OCD, but also mom and dad's generation weren't connected to the idea of collecting. I don't think so. You can imagine generations previous to that. They had no sort of sentimentality about shit. They just threw things out. You know, they were just like, we have to make room for more stuff. And, you know, in all fairness too, no one had back then, even when mom and dad were growing up, nobody had 4,000 square foot houses. That wasn't a thing yet.
Right.
So it wasn't a matter of space. But with collecting, I thought this would be fun because obviously it's nostalgic. And we have a different, you know, you and I will come from a very different POV on this because of the generational split of a decade. But yeah, I get, and there's also different periods with it, which is kind of fascinating. I'm fascinated by the eras of just what was available because now, and even when my kids were growing up, now my kids are getting a little older, but if you walk into a box store or a toy store, just walking down the toy department of any store, there is a product and a thing for every conceivable pop culture thing. And back then it wasn't. It was much more specialized. We had less to choose from, and different things were bigger back then, like baseball cards or sports cards in general. So I thought this would be kind of fun and something we get to rarely touch on because we talk about, you know, Star Wars on forward, especially with action figure collecting and the rise of nerd culture. But this is a little bit, and this ties in, this is kind of interwoven in the same sense, but I thought this would be a little bit of a departure too, which I think could be a good time.
Yeah, you have to think about the origins of collecting cards and where they come from and the idea of this like collectible and customizable iconography of whatever and how that fills into collecting full sets and what you're looking to do and then playing games with the things, trading. Actually really trading first, then playing games. I think really games with cards comes in, not playing cards, of course, but cards as we understand them, collectible cards, maybe in the 80s. Certainly Magic in 1993, I think, is probably the major mainstream event that brings that to the forefront. And it's still 30 years later, incredibly popular with Pokemon and Magic still is a dominant force in all the rest. So it is super interesting. Do you remember how many did you categorize? How many cards did you collect? Like how many? Because again, I have 6 different things that I collected at some point, and I'm wondering how many, if you were able to number them like that.
I think it probably was like 4.5 for me. There was 4 sort of mainline things, and then there were a couple of littler, smaller things that I was less involved with interspersed in there. So if we're just talking about cards, yeah, that was probably almost to what you had, almost to 6. I could probably even go to 6 if I just thought about things I dabbled with, but there were certainly, you know, those mainline things. I would say like 4.5 to 5-ish. All
right, so let's begin with you. I guess let's go in some sort of chronology. So we'll probably go through a lot of yours first, and there might be some crossover. I don't actually know. There might be crossover with one in particular, but where do you want to begin with this conversation on your end?
Yeah, I mean, for me, especially my generation, I think a lot of people my age could speak to this. If there's anybody out there. I know we're dying off now. We're older breed.
Jesus Christ.
It starts with baseball cards.
Oh, of course.
And I laugh about this because growing up, like let's say by the time I was able to start collecting things or having memories of just stuff, it was already the mid 70s. Right. And there was so little variety back then, man. There was just so little to choose from. And I think the few things that we had as boys, let's say in the mid 70s, was just kind of thrust upon us. And it was kind of expected, right? Because I was thinking a lot about this because I was thinking about G.I. Joe, which is a subject near and dear to your heart, obviously, Kyle. So I think about the 80s, even very early on, 82, 83, with G.I. Joe and the rise of like the 3 3/4 scale action figure and military toys in general, because of course it started in the late 70s with Star Wars figures and collecting with toys with our generations. But if I think about military toys, something occurred to me when I was just kind of jotting down notes for the episode. And that is that generations prior, let's say kids growing up in the 50s and 60s, especially boys, the military toy thing was a boon because you're playing off of World War II, where it was glorified and heroic, right? So the little green army men, the packages of those things, the Guns of Navarone play set, full scale 12-inch G.I. Joe dolls, Action Man over in Europe. Like that was a big thing. I mean, it was kind of the next breath or the next step in the evolution after cowboys and Indians. Now Native Americans, but back then it was called cowboys and Indians. You know, yeah. So that was very in fashion for the generations prior to, I would say just prior to my generation. But you know what occurs to me? And a lot of people probably already thought of this, but I'm an idiot. Vietnam came along.
Nam.
Right? Nam came along, and it was no longer popular or in the parlance to have military toys, because now it was a much war, our outlook as a culture on war was much different, right? And it was a much different war. So I didn't have military toys. So when I was born, I think everybody older, parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, right? They sort of gave us two things, baseball and baseball cards, and die-cast metal collectible cars, Matchbox and Hot Wheels. Those were the two things in, let's say, 75, where I was 1.5 years old. So baseball cards were, I don't even know how it started for me, but I know it didn't start from scratch because I had at least 2 to 3 shoe boxes full of baseball cards. So I think it was one of the 3 things that our Uncle Michael sort of gave to me when he outgrew them and when he became an adult, which was, this was a 3-tiered thing. He gave me his baseball cards, he gave me his Kiss albums, and he gave me his slot cars, which were, I mean, there's people young enough listening to the show probably don't even know what slot cars were. They were little electronic or electrical magnetic cars that ran on tracks with a groove in it. And you used to take them, you could have your own slot car setups at home, but I think they were relatively expensive, especially before they were mass produced. So you would take your slot cars to brick and mortar locations and race them, sort of like you did in the 80s with your RC cars, right? The hobby shop would have the dirt track behind the store and you could go race your RCs with other enthusiasts or whatever. Slot cars were the same thing. And I remember, because I didn't have any tracks or any setups, any infrastructure, he just gave me his cars, which were in fishing tackle boxes with the cars and the various parts, wheels and controllers and
that's cool,
different electrical components, which was really cool. So that was the baseball cards was the slot cars, and the Kiss albums were all bestowed from Uncle Mike. So, and as a kid, 3, 4, you're probably getting a little interested in baseball. You're getting into Little League and T-ball. So baseball cards was like the first thing that was, it wasn't even thought of. It was like, okay, it's a boy. He's 3 years old. We do baseball cards. It was just, that was one of the few things it seemed like that we had to choose from in that generation because we didn't have the variety back then. And I do remember like really loving them. I remember going through them. I do remember getting my own packs, whether it was from the stationery store or the supermarket checkout or the ice cream man. And I remember kind of, I guess, responding to the graphical nature of them, not just the ball players and the poses and all that kind of stuff and the stats on the back, but every season had a different graphical treatment. So every year, the Topps cards looked a little different than the prior year, and they had the different colors. sort of acknowledging the different teams, and then you had the team logos, and it was just, I remember it was kind of cool. I don't remember, it was probably the older kids back then that were trading and kind of wheeling and dealing with their friends, but I just remember enjoying them, taking them out and looking at them and organizing them by season, maybe organizing them by team or by league, stuff like that. It probably bled into when I started collecting action figures, let's say in the late 70s. So I was probably old enough and sophisticated enough to start realizing, okay, I'm missing Dave Winfield, so I could complete my Yankee collection if I get this guy. Because I was probably 6 years old at that time. So I started to get a little more sophisticated in knowing what I needed and knowing what I could go after. But then I think by the time collecting Star Wars came along, and then certainly later with Joe's and Transformers and all that, then, card collecting fell by the wayside, at least for baseball cards. But that was my entree into card collecting. And I think that was also another thing, Kyle, right? The previous generations of guys, now we're all grown nerds and man children and we collect everything. But my generation, I was raised by guys that basically, if they collected anything, was maybe 5 things that they could have collected: coins, stamps, baseball cards, and maybe if it was really crazy, they got into collecting Lionel trains, model trains. And that was the extent of it. Maybe comic books, but that was really it. So they were just passing on dad's generation, grandpa's generation. They were just passing on what they knew, because that's really what they had. They didn't have video games and home video games and indie comics and all this other toys and pop vinyls and all this other bitchin' stuff. They just had those few things. So they passed on the mantle to us. Or I may never even have discovered baseball cards, because I liked baseball as a kid, but I wasn't a diehard. I wasn't dyed in the wool baseball guy, but they were just passing on what they knew. And so that's really how I discovered baseball cards. And that's another thing I was thinking about before I pass it on to you. I wonder where those are, because they were already probably, a lot of my collection was probably cards from the late 60s, maybe even mid to late 60s, early 70s. So they were already old by the time I got a hold of them. And maybe my baseball card collecting bled into the early 80s, but that was it. So not that I think that collection was valuable. I never kept them in books. I never kept them behind plastic, right? But just for nostalgia's sake, I wonder where those cards are. Because again, mom and dad were pretty good about not throwing things out. I don't know if that was sentimentality at play there, or whether they just, maybe, was taking a page out of, I don't want to do to my kids what Granny did to me, where I can't go back and have anything tangible from my childhood. So, all right, what about you, my friend? Where did it start for you with the cards? And
I was going to kind of draw it together here. You got your Honus Wagner or whatever somewhere in is that the guy's name? The famous baseball card from like 1910 or something. So baseball cards were one of the 6 things that I wrote down, and I don't particularly remember how I got into them. My assumption is that it's some synthesis of our neighbors who were really into sports cards, who were very instrumental in me getting into hockey cards, which I'll talk about in a minute, which was a much bigger deal for me. But I think it might have also had to do maybe with Aunt Joni in some way. And I know that hockey card collecting, she definitely didn't have anything to do with me getting into it, but she definitely helped facilitate it. I have a specific memory I can share, but baseball cards I had, and what I remember about the baseball cards, first of all, I remember them being yellow. So what people probably know whatever brand that is. It's like they were like yellow. They're probably not even very nice baseball cards. And that's what I remember the brand, or at least one of the brands that I had. And this was the beginning of kind of my lifelong and still current obsession with sports statistics. I really love stats in sports. I just love them. Especially in baseball, which is such an individualized sport. Obviously, there are so many different things going on that do make it different, like who's pitching against you, or where you're, the distance of the home run wall and the park you're in, and all of the rest, and your position. Obviously, are you DHing, and So I love the variables, but generally speaking, baseball is a great sport in part because the statistics should go over time, and you should be able to make these generational comparisons that I think have been broken since the 90s, really, with Sosa and McGuire and everything, and moving on to Bonds and so on and so forth. But I think generally speaking, that's kind of cool. The continuity is there and it's neat. So when you think about Babe Ruth and his prolific career as a both a pitcher and a hitter, and then you think about what's going on with Ohtani today, you could theoretically compare them, although I think Babe Ruth was basically like a fat old man compared to Shohei Ohtani. So I don't know that they really are comparable. But so I had fun with baseball cards, but I just love turning them over, seeing the history, getting just a little blurb, the essential information, where they're born, maybe the system they came up in or where they went to school or whatever. And then just the stats, at bats, hits, doubles, triples, home runs, RBI, strikeouts, walks, the essentials, and obviously your average, the essentials, and focusing in and understanding how that all worked as a kid and knowing the rules. Isn't it interesting? I think about this. We were talking about this a little bit for purposes of where did it come up? I don't really remember, but I find that it's interesting that we have these. Oh no, that's what it was. It was athleticism when we were talking about I was naturally athletic. I have this natural understanding of sports statistics just based on these baseball cards, so that by the time we get to the era in the early 21st century of like Saber stats and stuff like that, that's kind of a lost era. You might remember a little bit. I fucking loved Saber stats when I was in college. Loved it. And like the entire statistical revolution, Moneyball kind of statistical revolution in baseball. That was like during my late baseball fandom, where it was fun to get into all of that sort of thing. And I think that a lot of that just comes, the numbers in baseball that are obsessed over to this day, I think that comes from a baseball card culture, at least for me. And so that's like my major memory of baseball cards. I will fuse this to another one of hockey cards because it makes sense here. And I guess we'll get out of sports after this, but hockey cards were a much bigger deal for me. And actually, I think I might have said on this show or another show that I gave my entire hockey card collection away to a fan of the show, probably last year or 2 years ago. My parents, and especially my dad, were eager to like unload everything that I left at their house over the many years since my childhood. And so they brought everything here and everything was in my garage, and slowly it's all put away now. But I've slowly like threw most of it away and kept a lot of things and just put it in the attic, my effects, as it were. And one of them were that literally thousands of hockey cards, most of them loose, which I thought was interesting, but I had a lot of books too. And I probably just had way too many and not enough books. In fact, I used to steal the binders at mom's old work at Business Express, the Delta connecting flight or airline, to make those little books. But probably between the years of 1992 to 1996, I collected hockey cards prolifically. Upper Deck, Pinnacle, Topps, Pro Set, Bowman, Donruss, Fleer. There are a bunch of them. And I used to get, I think it was called Hobart's or something. It was this very specialized magazine that was hockey card pricing that was done every month. Oh, and wow. You'd like go and they were expensive magazines, and I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I don't know where the fuck any of this shit went. All the magazines that I had like a subscription to that. And I remember the specific store that mom and I used to go into. There's a famous mall in New Hampshire called Fox Run Mall, but nearby there was a dying mall called Newington Mall. And there was like a hockey card or like a sports card store in there. It was like one of the last remaining vestiges of this building as Fox Run Mall kind of ate its lunch. And I used to go there and just buy a bunch of things. And I was deeply connected to hockey cards through our neighbors as well. And again, the statistical love, having this encyclopedic knowledge, actually, Declan and I, our nephew, were talking about this recently. Like a lot of the crazy, and I don't know if you've been playing this awesome game. I don't even know what the hell it's called, but it just started in recent months. Have you seen it? It's like a grid. It's like a grid of 3x3, like a tic-tac-toe grid. And on one axis will be 3 teams, and on the other axis will be 3 teams of a sport. And your job in this game is to just put players that played for both teams in those various slots. So it'll be like Blue Jays. There'll be like a vertical for Blue Jays and Angels, and Yankees and Red Sox, and Blue Jays and Red Sox, and all those things. And you're supposed to put the names in. And we were wondering, like, why are people so good at this? Because I couldn't do that for baseball today at all. I could do it a little bit for hockey, but I can do it better. I play it for football.
Okay.
And even then I'm totally largely ignorant. And we were like, where does that endemic knowledge come from? And he was saying, and I think he was right, that for the older generation, the Uncle Mikes and the Derricks and the people that have just this weird endemic knowledge of really nothing at all, but this really important deep roster knowledge and where people played and transactions and stats, it comes from baseball cards and football cards and hockey cards.
That's a
and
great
all those
point.
kinds of things.
Yeah.
Because no one is these days. I always look up people's statistics when I'm reading about them, football, hockey, whatever. And I always look up their salary information. I love doing it on Sports Track. I love that Sports Track. That website is awesome where you can see like their whole salary history. But back in the day, you were really captive to what you had. So you probably became pretty, and actually there's a Wonder Years episode, I think, about it, where Paul is studying the baseball cards and Kevin is like testing him on what they say or whatever. And like who's RBI, how many RBI did this guy have?
That's awesome.
It's pretty cool. Like that kind of specialized knowledge, which is useless and stupid, is still from the analog era where you had to really be focused. I don't think I'm sure there are people that have really Rain Man like tendencies like that today, but probably not the same tendencies at all. So yeah, hockey cards and baseball cards. But by the time 96-ish or something rolled around, I wasted so much money on hockey cards. And the story I was going to tell about Aunt Joni was we used to go, as you know, we've talked about it before, go to New Hampshire to shop. So for people that don't know, New Hampshire has no sales tax, which is a big deal in the Northeast. And so people go there to shop. And there are a bunch of big outlets in New Hampshire, but one is in Conway. And our cousin used to live out there. Our mom's cousin used to live there. And we used to go there. And I have a very specific memory of being there during one of those trips and Aunt Joni buying me an entire box of sets of cards for a pro set or some hockey thing that was probably cheap and old. And I was so amped, and that kept me busy the entire trip, just slowly opening them and reading them and studying them. It was so fun. So I have a very specific memory of that, and I'm grateful for that. But yeah, that's about the long and the short. I would say that's like the early generation, and then there's gonna be like a mid generation and a late generation. I'm done with cards by 1998, maybe.
Okay.
So
you were out by then.
Yeah,
okay.
I would say all this happened within. If you don't count baseball really, and you get into like me really being actively collecting, it's probably like a 6-year period really where this all happens. Thousands of dollars down the of communion money and mowing the lawn and weeding people's yards and selling lemonade, doing all that stuff on hockey cards. Would love that money back, but nonetheless.
You know what, Kyle? I was so tuned out by, let's say, the mid 90s on this sort of thing. How much was like a pack of hockey cards if you walked into a drugstore and bought one? Let's say in 95.
I want to say it would be like, it would depend on the brand, but probably between $1.99 and maybe $3.99 or something like
okay.
that. Yeah.
Oh, getting up there, actually.
That sounds about right to me, because that would be the whole tension is like, what are you collecting the cards for? I remember this being a big thing with my friend Tim when we were collecting hockey cards and we would go to the store on Long Island, and it's like, all right, you can get the Topps cards. They're not very good. You can get more of them, or you can get like the really nice Bowman or Flair cards that are probably 3 times more, but I guess they have more intrinsic value. But at that time I was like, I don't know that I give a shit. I just bought whatever, I didn't have there was no rhyme or reason. The one thing I forgot to say about my hockey collection, and I noticed this when I found my binders, and I remember doing this, is I separated them all by team. So I had a shit ton of loose ones that I hadn't organized yet, but I had binders full of just ones where they were organized by team. And it was really cool to go through. And I know the NHL like the back of my hand from 1988 to 1995 or 1996. Holy moly, man. Just pulling things out. But after that, it falls apart a little bit. So yeah, that I'd say was the sports card thing. And are the sports cards still relevant? I was reading a little bit about them coming into this. It seems like certain companies have for instance, in hockey, Upper Deck apparently is like the thing in hockey. Okay. If you want like value.
I always forget about that company.
But I don't know, is that still something people do? It just seems quaint. People still collect stamps and coins. That's also quaint. So, I don't.
True.
But we have so much better access to these athletes that we worship and we want to know more about. It almost seems kind of dumb. You could just go on Wikipedia and open up fucking new tabs for every player on there and read everything about them.
It's much smaller than it was. I guess that has to do with the digital age too. But you know what's ironic? I could think of 2 specifically trading card stores, not comic and collectibles, trading cards within 10 miles of here. Brick and mortar, still in business, been in business for as long as I've been out here, and dealing specifically in trading cards. So it is still a thing, at least enough to keep a person's doors open and have a brick and mortar and have that overhead or whatever. So it is interesting. You collected these because you were passionate about the sport. I love what you said about the Paul Pfeiffer being encyclopedic about these things, because that speaks to an era even beyond the Wonder Years where your loyalties weren't divided among such a variety of hobbies. Like it was like, if you were into that sort of thing, it had to be one of only a few things, like let's say baseball. And it's kind of a warm and fuzzy period for me too, because I think just in general, let's say baseball specifically was just so much more important back then, so much more beloved, so much more universally revered as a hobby, right? Which is, the national pastime, right? It's really interesting to think about. And I love what you said too about just sort of, I don't know, like you have this period where you have these things, this tactile thing, which is like this indelible record of a certain era in any sport. It's a record of any specific season, any specific year. I love seeing it that way. And it's interesting too, Kyle, like your sort of point of entry was your love of that sport, your budding love for that sport and the stats and everything, where my thing, I can remember like really responding to the graphic visual nature of it. And I think now to myself, and maybe this did exist, but not to my knowledge. If you had, let's say, a baseball card series that had sort of Mad Magazine styled cartoon illustrations, caricatures of the players, like let's say Jack Davis art of an entire roster from an entire season of baseball, right? I think that would have hooked the Dagan types, because eventually when more fun things came along, like Star Wars and G.I. Joe and Transformers, I was out because the sport itself wasn't a big enough hook. So you could have got those nerds, those 70s and 80s nerds, if you kind of tied in the comic or comic book, I don't know, motif into that thing. I wonder why that was never a big thing, because certainly Mad Magazine was a big thing. And I think you probably had those people that crossed over between comics and Mad Magazine and the sports cards and liked everything. But those are also two very distinct types of people, right? So to have both things blended in would have been really interesting. From here, Kyle, I'm going to go back to cards and we're going to talk about stickers, and I want to talk about sticker albums and all this kind of stuff. One thing very specific that I never get to talk about that I'm excited about, but I have to sort of take a fork in the road here and talk about something that occurred to me that I rarely talk about, but was such a huge thing. Maybe only 1 or 2 years before you were born, in '84. And that's the Smurfs. And it was a pop culture phenomenon that I remember so distinctly. And it was brilliant for 2 reasons that I think about. And of course, we all know Smurfs now. And if you're old enough to remember the Hanna-Barbera cartoon on TV that ran for like the better part of a decade. I think it ran into almost 1990, started in the early 80s. And of course, that derived from a European comic. A Belgian cartoonist named Pail created the Smurfs, and it was really kind of a beautifully drawn, very European flavored comic that became popular in Europe and then eventually found its way to the United States and North America. But I don't remember if the media or the toy came first. It was probably pretty neck and neck. But the toys were a phenomenon for 2 reasons. First of all, these little Smurf figurines were sculpted rubber, plastic. They weren't posable. They weren't action figures, but they came out after the craze of the 3 3/4 action figures. So Star Wars and Adventure People and all the earlier 70s and 80s action figures they already had a foothold in the market when the Smurfs came out. But the Smurfs were different. Again, because they weren't necessarily easy to play with in that they were posable and stuff, but they were highly collectible. It's the first toy I remember, and still maybe the biggest, man, where it was appealing to both boys and girls. Very brilliant on that front. It was acceptable. If you were an 8-year-old boy, it was totally acceptable to collect Smurfs, and it was expected. 8-year-old girl, of course, same thing, right?
Interesting.
And
Yeah,
they
the
were
unisex
everywhere.
stuff's interesting. Very interesting.
Every box store,
Yeah.
every stationery store, every flea market, they were huge. Everybody rocked the T-shirts. It was like a thing like the Ghostbusters, only a little later, where it was like it just really seeped into the pop culture fabric, right? And the other brilliant thing was because there were so many, you just gave them as gifts to everybody, even adults, because let's say there were hundreds of Smurfs. Everyone in your life that did a thing or were known for something or had a hobby, there was a Smurf to give that person. If your grandmother was a great baker, you would give her the baker Smurf. If your nephew loved ice hockey, you would give him the ice hockey Smurf, right? If your niece played Little League, you'd give her the baseball Smurf. So they were just brilliant on multiple fronts because it was just this thing that everybody had a couple. Your aunt had a couple in her kitchen that represented what the thing she cared about. If your aunt was a gardener, she had a little gardening Smurf. It was like pop culture wildfire. I'm not sure it lasted that long. Like maybe it was huge at the pinnacle of, bigness for a couple of years, but that was a thing that I remember everybody having. Me, my friends, my contemporaries, my little sisters, their friends, every adult, like nobody was immune to the Smurf craze. And I think what's kind of phenomenal about it is I think it was mostly about the product. It wasn't necessarily driven by the cartoon or by the TV. Now, eventually they'd be on TV, Smurf record albums, Smurf everything, Smurf books, Smurf clothing. It was everywhere, but I think it was mostly about the little collectible thing itself. And it came right in between people my age, especially boys will remember, it came between Star Wars, let's say Empire Strikes Back, and the beginning G1 of G.I. Joe and Transformers. So it came in this thing where the market just wanted to gobble something up. And again, it did. I think it would be fascinating to know what the sales figures were, because it seemed like you couldn't turn around without seeing a Smurf something. I remember going to the mall, there was Smurfs. I went to Sweezy's, which was like a local department store growing up, huge Smurf department. Every flea market had, peddlers sort of dumping Smurfs on everybody. I mean, it was just like Smurf. I had hundreds of them probably.
Yeah, there's a few floating
sure
around my stuff. I have a few of them around here.
You do? Yeah, that was the thing. So many probably just fell in with everything. Mm-hmm. Right? Especially because I remember mom and dad having, mom had a couple of curios above the kitchen sink or had one on her dashboard, in the car. Like they were just everywhere. So I have to give a shout out to the Smurfs because I love it from an artistic standpoint, because those comics, it bled less so into the TV show, but very beautifully drawn, very appealing, had a real old 1930s, 1940s Disney sort of Sorcerer's Apprentice look to it. Really beautiful, volumetric cartoon drawings. But I think that was the thing. There was just something for everybody to relate to, and super clever too from a design standpoint, because they were all the same thing, right? Like Handy Smurf had a pencil behind his ear, or else he looked exactly like every other Smurf. Hefty had a tattoo. That was it. So probably not too much overhead from a standpoint of, okay, we're just going to make the football guys just going to have a football helmet. Right. So it's
it's like the way the G.I. Joe molds started using each other's, like, we'll use this crotch.
Yeah. But from a production standpoint, people didn't care. Dude, they just wanted it.
I looked up, I don't know anything about this Adventure People from Fisher Price. This is almost like this is an even earlier example. Because I was thinking of Star Wars as being kind of the pioneer of we're doing this, but this is actually the pioneer of where
it is. That's the flashpoint.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I mean, it's a pretty modern looking toys. You could argue that they don't have the deep level of granular customization and articulation, but they kind of look better than some GI Joes and turtle characters and stuff, just in terms of their all white people. I've noticed. I was staring at them.
No, there are some black guys.
Really? I don't see any.
There are a couple. I had one that was like a motorcycle daredevil, like motocross type.
Yeah, they have.
But you know what?
Maybe they have. Oh, well, there is one here. He has a helmet on, so yeah. Maybe
Yes,
it's him.
I remember him.
They put the black guy in a helmet.
Dude, they were phenomenal. Soft, really high quality,
yeah, they're
like
cool.
soft touch plastic. They had that open-ended play philosophy that like an early Playmobil had, where it was like really about creating your own stories. It wasn't a license. It was just imaginative play, whether you're doing deep sea diving or, you know, cops and robbers type thing.
I can't imagine the perverted shit people did with some of these female ones.
And they all had the pose, right? Like, I don't know if it's their left or right arm if you're looking at it, but
yeah, I'm looking at it.
They all had a neutral pose where they stand and look normal, but they could also be gripping the steering wheel of a vehicle.
Yeah, one hand is like this and one hand is like this. It looks
right.
One, yeah.
Super. They were really the Flashpoint for 3 3/4 inch action figure,
shit,
but Star Wars was a license. That was the thing.
Oh, and they came in 3-packs.
Super cool.
Wow.
And got into outer space, right? Like
yeah, there was an
aliens and
astronaut
rocket
one.
ships and stuff.
Yeah. Oh, they came as individual ones too. Okay, so yeah, I'm just looking at these. These are wow, and these were on the shelf. Like some of these have Toys R Us price tags on them.
Very you know, later on, because Tommy, my friend Tommy, had all these. Later on, they would be all the poor adventure people would be the cannon fodder action figures in the G.I. Joe campaigns.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Definitely, you need some bodies and some casualties, no doubt. By the way, I misunderstood our intent behind this. I thought we were only doing cards, so I only have cards to talk about here. Although
that was a departure.
I really don't have anything else that I would collect outside of toys. I don't think so. It doesn't, and video games and things we talk about. So I think we'll be fine there. All right, cool. Smurfs, I have that written down. Maybe Pogs would be the only thing that I got into when I was in the mid 90s. That would be like a different sort of thing. But I feel like that lasted one day for me. Okay. I wanted to talk about this, and I went and looked these up because I didn't know what they were. And I didn't know, I guess I should have known better. Like, of course, they're famous. The Marvel Universe Marvel cards from the early 90s. Now, I never bought these cards, but I was given a bunch of them, like probably hundreds of them, I would say, from someone. And I remember, so this is one of those weird childhood memories. It was like a friend of dad's kid, and he was doing something with them, or they were hanging out, or they were doing work together. And I was hanging out with his son at their house, and he had like boxes of these Marvel cards, and they were fascinating to me for two reasons. Number one is that I just wasn't introduced to any of this stuff as a kid, with a rare exception. Dagan read, I think, like X-Men and X Factor maybe, or something like that. And so I had a few of these, like access to a few things, and later on I would get more into the toys, and that would kind of open my eyes more to superheroes and whatnot. Although I wasn't really ever very into it from that base level. I just wasn't a comic reader. I was kind of a poser in some sense. But this kid gave me these cards, and I was obsessed with them because I was like, who the fuck are these characters? There were a million characters. And it really did, in my little primal brain, set. It's like, now I know who Omega Red is, and now I know who the Silver Samurai is, and the cool thing about this, and this is what I looked this up, was I guess the big draw about Marvel Universe, and I remember this, and I didn't know that this was the intent, was they had these statistics on the back of them that were totally made up for each character. So it's like, this is the character's strength, his speed, his whatever, his stamina, and all of the rest, and then you would basically try to compare and contrast your favorite character, hero villain combinations, or whatever the case might be, to see who might stand up to who, or who might do better in certain battles or whatever. So it was this kind of mind game, or this way to kind of exercise your brain as you went through these cards. And so that was something that came to mind for me pretty hardcore, because I really, really loved those cards. I remember them even coming with checklist cards. Like, that would probably be a bummer when you got that card in a pack or whatever, and then you'd be able to check all the ones. And I ended up just having a ton of these and really cared about them. I gave them ultimately to, and this is what's so funny about them, is I gave them to, and this was back in 2019. So it might've just been that Declan would have been interested, but I gave them to Finley and to Dash, our nephews. And so they live on in some way, but I'm like, yeah, because I was going through our stuff at Dad's, and I'm like, you can have these, but that was where those came from.
That's so cool.
Yeah, so the Marvel cards. And then the other thing I wanted to say in this kind of vein was something, I don't know if you remember, a company called Impel did G.I. Joe trading cards in 1991 and 1992. And I had so many of those. And then I have now a complete collection of them as an adult.
Oh,
So,
you do?
Yeah. And I want to get them framed in like some huge frame in order or something, which I think would be cool because the art is dope. The art is super cool. And it's unique to that run of cards. And then they would have the little stats and information, but that was less interesting to me with G.I. Joe for some reason. So in terms of licensed, so we talked about sports cards. Now we're talking about in terms of licensed collectible cards that you didn't do anything with. I think those were the two that I really got into at different times. I never bought the Marvel cards, mostly because I think that was maybe one or two runs, like waves, and that was it, and it was over, and I had them all. But the G.I. Joe cards, I remember buying them at Cumberland Farms in Maine when I lived up there. I used to buy weird things at that Cumberland Farms. I bought the Street Fighter comic book series, like all of those at that Cumberland Farms and all these other things. So they had some cool stuff, and we were in Maine. I mean, that's why I always think about Pogs, but I remember by the time Pogs reached us in Maine, it was already kind of over in a lot of other like more urban places. So it's probably the same situation here, but I wanted to shout out those Impel G.I. Joe cards. They're beautiful. In fact, I still have, someone sent me this. I have this card, but they had this from their childhood, and he just sent it to me as a nice gesture to the P.O. box. Is the Snake Eyes card. I don't know if it comes through.
Oh, dude, that's so sick.
And this is him in his 1985 garb. And then it has like little little information on the back for them. So it has like a little write-up and the file name and the birthplace and all the rest. Unknown.
Is there anybody cooler than that character? He is the coolest character.
He is, but the thing about Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow is that they're the Boba Fetts of G.I. Joe. They've been completely obliterated by every time a new G.I. Joe. It's like, oh, a new G.I. Joe toy's coming out. Snake Eyes.
They don't give him a rest.
Dude, it's always Snake Eyes, Storm Shadow, Baroness, Destro, Cobra Commander, Duke, Scarlet. Yeah. Right? Yes. Something like that. It's like, dude, there are so many characters. Can we move on? And I really feel like they ruined Boba Fett by focusing on him too much. Now he's not mysterious at all. And they've kind of ruined Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow, I think, many times over to the point where, they are mega. I mean, they're mega cool. But do you know that we have, I think it's us. Let me look this up, that there's a Storm Shadow. There's a missile apparently called the Storm Shadow. Yeah, it's a French-British low observable long-range stealth air launch cruise missile, and it's called the Storm Shadow.
That can't be a coincidence.
No, I would think not, right?
No, not. I mean, that's a great name. If I almost want it to not be a coincidence that somebody thought of that again for a missile. It's pretty cool.
It came out in 1994, so I think it must be.
It has to be referential, right? Man, you're making me see the early 90s. I get mad about the early 90s because I want to go back because I missed so much shit. Now, don't get me wrong. I was already older. I would graduate high school in 92. And I was already, skateboarding had already long established a foothold with me. I don't regret anything, but I just miss so much cool shit. This reminds me of one thing. I just want to get your opinion on this. I just heard last night from some toy collection channel I follow that a toy company, maybe it's NECA, don't quote me on that, but they're putting out a new line of Street Fighter action figures, and they look super cool. And they announced 3 with a limited variety of pictures so far. I'm going to tell you 2 of them, and I want you to give me the third one you would choose in this lineup, and then I'll tell you who they really put out. Okay? Chun-Li, Ryu, and who would you choose as a third if you were just releasing 3 as an initial launch? Who would be your third?
I think there are a few reasonable answers, but they all have to be within that original 12, I would say. And so you might want to go with Bison, right?
That's a good call.
Or Blanca is the other one that came to mind.
Blanca would be a nice for variety. Yeah. Bison for a bad guy. Mm-hmm. You know what the third one is?
Mm-mm.
And I'm not mad. I like the character, but I just think it's a weird choice. Fei Long.
Isn't
that
so
weird?
Boring? He's
so
like the
weird.
most visually boring of all of the fighters. In fact, I would argue that he came in the new challengers, right? So he was definitely the most boring of those 4. And then
I would agree.
And he's probably the worst of those first 16 characters, I guess, is what I'm saying. So
I feel like they wanted to do Cammy, but they didn't want to look like perverts.
Right.
But like you want to do Cammy.
She's really running into the ground, I think, in a lot of stuff too.
That's another one. Yeah. Talk about the lack of mystique.
Dude, that's so disappointing just because you could really answer that question in a million different, and not a million, but probably 5 different ways that would have been really cool figures.
Yeah. I like your answers.
Yeah.
Your answers really make sense. I mean, I might have thought of Guile. I might have thought of Sagat just because he's so big.
Dude, a Guile figure, like a really beautiful articulated, like 6-inch G.I. Joe style figure where it came with it would be so cool if it came with stands where he does you can make him do the flash kick. And so it would have him like, there would be like maybe just these little invisible sticks and that would be sick.
Yeah. You know what? It's interesting that you say that because I think Chun-Li, they're highly posable. It looks like these figures. I think she has like the blue flame to put around her kicking foot. So it looks like they have their moves. I
would love that. Like just him in a crouching form upside down with just like an arc around him.
Sick.
Yeah. That would
be amazing.
Or him with the like mid brush with his head in his hair, you know, with his comb. That would be sick too.
Shout out to Guile.
He's a great, I love Guile.
I love playing as him still.
Yeah. I'm a little too conspicuous playing as him. It's like, why are you crouching?
You got to have that charge. Yeah, that charge technique is hard, man.
It's like, why are you always crouching? I'm like, well, you know why I'm always crouching.
Cats are so good. I don't know if it was just kind of re-establishing the parameters for play and making it a little less extreme, but now you don't even see people crouching. Like they're just getting off flash kicks. It's like, I don't know how I'm going to beat this guy. He's not even charging back or down. You know what I mean? It's so quick.
Sonic.
I want to see those Marvel cards, man, because early 90s Marvel, I think about, that was my hook into American comics. Jim Lee, pre-image McFarlane, especially on Spider-Man, pre-image Rob Liefeld. I don't know if it was that everything was with these younger artists, it was feeling a little more contemporary and a little more anime-esque, but that was what sold me on X-Men. And those guys, not just them, those three, but that generation of artists, a lot of them would later form Image, you know, they were really famous for not only sort of evolving and exaggerating the character design, like McFarlane with Spider-Man, but they would also create new characters that were exciting. And they were also known for plucking really sort of deep cut, little known characters out of obscurity and making them cool, you know. And they represented a whole generation where I feel like you could talk about Rob Liefeld now and say the guy couldn't draw feet, but those guys made comics exciting, and they made me want to look at Western comics. You know, they made it feel really colorful and really exciting again, and not so boring, and they made it feel a little less men in tights, you know, for me. And that's why I'll always, that's my wheelhouse for Western comic books. I'm very nostalgic about that era, but I was so tuned out. Like if it was 3 years prior, I would have been so into those cards, but I was already I outgrew it, you know, so I missed all that crap. But I love it. I love thinking about that generation. I think of early Pokemon, Pogs. I was already like late in high school, you know, so I missed that.
I was too old to be playing Pokemon when it came out. I was in 9th grade when Pokemon came out, but I was playing it nonetheless. I mean, I was just too old to be playing it. Or at least that was the vibe at that point. It's funny how it became such an adult phenomenon, but it was through the kids that played it. I'll tell you, my contemporaries were not playing Pokemon in high school. So.
No. I feel like your generation was that pivotal sort of razor's edge generation where it was starting to become acceptable. Well, it was probably 2, 3, or 4 years later than you, where it became a thing that it was acceptable now, right? I think of that generation when you got a little older and you were collecting Star Wars and they had the toy collecting magazines, and it was becoming more acceptable. It was becoming more broad. You know, there was a broader base of older collectors. But again, like you think back only 20, 25 years prior, where it was like, again, adult collectors were maybe collecting model trains, you know, so how much it grew, unless you were really, you know, one of those rarefied dudes or dudettes living in your parents' basement in your 40s in the 60s, which didn't exist back then. It was just a different time. I think where I have to go from here, Kyle, because it's kind of weird. I think back to sort of just collectible cards coming out of sports. And it started in the late 70s with Star Wars cards. And then, of course, crossed over into the early 80s with Empire Strikes Back cards. But For some reason, I got a pack here and there. Like I had some of them, but I think of it as like maybe somebody put it as a gift topper on my birthday or something. Like I wasn't actively pursuing them or really was even aware that they existed for some reason. But that's where that Jack Davis sort of nerd dynamic comes into card collecting, where I kind of feel like it's weird that I missed it, because back then you're a kid, you want all these things. Star Wars was really where I actively got into wanting to collect something where there was some autonomy. Like I'd get an action figure, flip the card back over, and sit there dreaming about completing the set. Like Star Wars was my entry into that sort of thing. And you don't have the resources as a kid. You got to wait for a birthday. You got to wait till grandma gives you the wink, wink, nudge, nudge, let's go to the toy store, or a report card, or Christmas, right? So I didn't even have allowance because I didn't do shit as a kid. So it's like I didn't have my own income. But where the card collecting thing makes sense is that's a little bit of a ice cream man priced way to collect the thing when you don't have resources for even an action figure, let alone a play set or a vehicle. It's like you always had $1 for the ice cream man. You could always work that up, whether it was bribing mom and dad, nugging on grandpa's shirt sleeve, whatever it is. There was always a way to get that pack of cards from the ice cream man. That's why I think it's weird that I wasn't aware of collecting cards so I really largely missed Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back trading cards, even though they existed. Then I remember, I'm not sure if there was Raiders of the Lost Ark collecting cards for Indy or not. Somebody out there will know the answer to that. But I do remember the Temple of Doom cards coming out.
The best indie movie.
And that was the first Ice Cream Man thing that I remember. Okay, sick, right? That this is awesome. But you know what came out at about the same time, maybe a little earlier? And I think this was about a year before you were born, was Return of the Jedi. They did something different. They came out with stickers and a sticker book instead of the trading cards. Now, I think there were still Return of the Jedi trading cards as well. Especially, I think I've heard of guys complain that they never got them in the West. Let's say it was Topps or Fleer. It was probably Topps. But they did have this Panini sticker book. And it was brilliant. I remember going into the drugstore, seeing the sticker book. You bought the packs of stickers separately than the book. And then your goal was to collect these things and fill the book up with the stickers. Some were just one-off stickers, and some were pieces of a mosaic that you could put together. So a mosaic of a space battle, a mosaic of Jabba's palace. And you just got as many packs as mom and dad would let you get. And you try to fill this sticker book. It played on the sticker phenomenon, which was a huge thing back then, right? Think of like growing up, bubble stickers and oil stickers and scratch and sniff, right? So it played on the sticker thing, but it also tied in the dynamic of, card collecting and wanting to complete a set. I remember being so smitten by this goddamn sticker book, man. Like, and it was frustrating because it was frustrating to get doubles. But this is where me and my 3 best friends all collected. And this is where my trading started, because we wanted to, I got doubles of this tail thruster of a Star Destroyer. I have this like 3 times over. Do you have the other half of Salacious Crumb that I can complete this scenario at Jabba's Palace, or the battle over the Sarlacc pit, or the Endor battle with the Ewoks? So there was always wheeling and dealing going on with trading, but it started with this sticker book, this Return of the Jedi sticker book. And I thought it was cool to anchor the collecting where prior, maybe you were super serious and you had the binder with the vinyl sleeves. But usually we just had things thrown in a shoebox. That was the state of 70s and 80s card collecting. But this was anchored in having that book. So you got the packs and you tried to fill the book. I loved this thing. That was really I'll talk about a couple other things that I collected in a bit, but that was really the one thing where I remember being hot on a hot summer day. Ice Cream Man comes along. I could get a frozen treat or an ice cream, but I always got the sticker pack. I had to complete this thing. I would suffer and not have the snack, just to get another pack of Return of the Jedi stickers to see if I could finish
You still
off,
have this book?
the Death Star battle page.
Do you have the book still?
That's the thing. I wonder if that's around in one of those tchotchke boxes with like old trophies, right? Old plushes. My baby Joey, my baby Joey doll that everybody busts my balls about. But I mean, that's the thing. There is hope. There is a chance that stuff's still floating around, because I think mom and dad, and again, I bet a big part of this. Did we ever tell mom's what is it? Nini Chow Hai?
Oh, Mimi Chow Hai.
Mimi Chow
Mimi
Hai.
Chow Hai. Yeah.
Her stuffed plush cat that she loved. That was like her whoopee, right? That was like her security blanket as a kid that apparently Granny unapologetically threw out at some point. Again, like way before mom was an adult. Like just when mom started getting nostalgic, like 15, you're at that bittersweet age where it's like you're growing up and you're going through puberty and dating and worried about school, and you're just starting to kind of you're starting to wax nostalgic about being a kid. And it's like, where's Mimi Chow Hai? And Granny's like, I threw that shit out like 10 years ago. Granny.
No sentimentality at all from the old
None.
country, I'll tell you.
None. I think that really is like a depression generation thing, and which is ironic, right? It's like, I don't know, just thinking about how much they had, let's say, in the early 60s compared to 30 years prior, where it was like everybody was struggling just to survive, and it was like, this is too much. But again, it was a small space. Mom grew up, I loved that house, but it was a small house.
Yeah, because
even
I
with
always
the addition built up.
I was going to say, I really didn't even realize as a kid that the back was an addition until I was older, and I was like, wait, this didn't exist at all. Because when you think about, so when that happened in the 80s, I guess, right? That addition, or was it?
No, that was always around.
For me. You, okay,
that had to happen late in the 60s. By late in the 60s.
Oh, okay, cool. So yeah, that adds a whole new dimension to the space because it was a much smaller home before that.
Really? Seriously? Yeah.
All right. So where do we go from here? How many more things do you have to talk about? Because I have one more set of two.
I have two.
Okay. All right. So I'll go into these here. What I love about where cards went, and I still like the cards are in this space today, it's just not for me, but is playing a game with them. And it's almost full circle when you think about playing cards and then them deviating to being just these things that exist for visual flair and all that, and then going back to using them in a game. And I remember, I don't want to act like I was there at the very, very beginning, because I wasn't. But I was playing Magic the Gathering in probably 1995. Magic came out in 93. And I don't know how I became aware of it. I actually don't remember at all, but it must have been the same people I was playing D&D with, the same people that I was playing with my toys and video games. So, Eric, and because I had like different friends. I say like my friend Tim was like my sports friend. He was my closest friend, but he was like my sports friend and all that. And then Eric was like my nerdy friend, and Bryce was my music friend and all of that. And so it was through Eric that I think I adopted a lot of this stuff, but I really was fascinated and really into Magic early on. And I got out of it. I was probably done with Magic by 96 or something like that. And I don't know where my cards are. They probably be very valuable because I think all of those early cards are worth some amount of money. And I had a lot of early things. I don't remember very much about them, but I remember learning how to play the game, and you have all of your land and tapping things and turning things sideways or doing whatever it is you're doing. And there would be little tournaments and people would play at the mall or at school. And I've said this before, but there's a really wonderful YouTube video of someone uploading the very first Magic tournament ever. That was like an official Magic tournament from 1994 in New York City. And it's dope, dude. Like, you want to see the progenitor of the nerd. And I mean that with all due respect. Go watch this video. These are your grandfathers of like, they paved the road. These are the kinds of people that did the heavy lifting. And I love, and they all just gathered and they played, and it was cool. It's a really, really cool look back. So Magic was a thing for me for a little while, and it's cool to see that it's still around, although it's pretty controversial and a lot of people don't particularly care for it anymore. And then the other thing that I picked up, and I wrote down this went from 1995 to 2001. I probably was in the 96 to 98 range with this one. Was Star Wars customizable card game. I really, really loved this too. So when I went to private school and Catholic school in Dover, New Hampshire, we would leave school and there was actually like Dover's a little town, like a little village. It's cool. So you go down and there was a card, like comic and whatever shop down there. There was a game store called Game Exchange too, where you would go and they had used games, but you'd also go and pay money to go play games. So like if you didn't have an N64, you didn't have a PlayStation or whatever, you can go and like rent time and play, which was pretty neat. So all those things were nearby. And so we would go. So I don't know if I've ever told this story. I don't know how I fell into this, but when I was in private school, specifically in 7th and 8th grade, I got offered a job basically by the school where if I stayed, so school was over, let's say at 2:30 or something, and I had to stay until 5 at this desk in front of the school and like behind these doors. And when people came to pick up their kids from this daycare, I just had to let them through the door because the door locked automatically. And I would literally get paid $5 a day for this. $5 a day for 2.5 hours or whatever. And I remember I used to get in trouble all the time because I would just leave and people like couldn't get in. And thinking back on it, I was like, wow, it was probably really annoying. Because I'd be like, oh, I'm going to go do this thing instead. So people would be trying to get into the school and calling and yelling and all this kind of stuff. But then I would go up and the sister Monica, that was the principal. She fucking hated me ultimately. I got I had a huge mohawk and all this stuff at some point, and we didn't have a good relationship, but nonetheless, she would give me $25 in cash. They probably had like petty cash sitting around or whatever. And then I would go spend all of it on whatever. And a lot of it were these Star Wars customizable cards, the customizable card game. And this was a deep Magic like game as well. And I was reading about it in preparation for the show, and it was tickling a lot of memories because I remember it where they were saying there was a core game. And then basically it was an early example of downloadable content, basically, where it would be like, all right, now we're releasing the Bespin cards. Now we're releasing the Hoth cards. Now we're releasing the Jabba's Palace cards and so on. And then there would be this whole new set. And I was like, damn, I remember that. I remember that so deeply. And I don't know where the hell these things went at all either. I might have even given them away or sold them at some point. You know what I think actually I'm thinking now in my head, and this is kind of crazy because I hadn't really thought about it, is I think I might have just sold them, all of them, to a friend of mine. And eventually I was like, I'm over this. And, I was like, I want $50. I want to go buy fucking Street Fighter versus X-Men or whatever the hell it is I wanted to buy at that point. So that's the last stuff I wanted to bring up in terms of collecting cards so again, it was the sports cards era and then the license card era. And now we're in these are licensed, but one of them is licensed anyway, but the game era. And again, this all melds into my love of D&D and dice rolls and all of that. That was all from the same era, but I really took D&D with me. I kind of left this stuff in the past. I think I realized as a young kid, I just didn't, it's as you said earlier, I didn't have the resources to really do this. I remember playing Magic specifically and being so woefully inadequately equipped to play Magic at a high level because I simply didn't have access to enough decks or cards to make like a really cogent and good deck. And I think if I was introduced to this stuff a little bit later in life, or it came out, maybe I would have taken a different, more positive trajectory towards it. But it came and went. And man, I let money burn a hole in my pocket when I was a kid. It's crazy, crazy, crazy times. So that's the long and the short of that. Where do you want to take it?
You know what? Magic. I don't even know if you know about my background with Magic the Gathering or my lack of background with this. So let me explain to you guys. And again, I don't know if Colin knows too much about this chapter in my life, but once upon a time, there were 3 Colins in my life. Now there's 2, and I love them both very much. One of my dearest friends, Colin, who I saw last week, who's a guy I made in college, a friendship I forged in college. And of course, the other Colin you're looking at, right? But there was a third Colin once upon a time. College roommate Colin. Now, Colin, the other Colin M., one of my dearest friends, still to this day, he was a college buddy, but he was not a roommate. There was another Colin, third Colin. He was a roommate in college. I couldn't stand this dude. He was just the most obnoxious dude ever. So let me explain my background with this guy. There was a certain period of time where I was in art school. I started in 94, and 2 of my best friends from Long Island had already gone a year prior to this school in Philadelphia. We were not, but before we ever became roommates, I was thrown in with these other randos. And this guy, Colin, was one of them. We had a really cool apartment because the dorms for my school back then were in this high-rise apartment complex. It just happened to be that they finagled some deal with these apartment buildings. So we didn't have actual dorms. These were apartment buildings that people were in, especially older, sort of elderly, sort of nice. I would say upper middle class, but certainly middle class apartments. Very nice. And I was in this 2-bedroom apartment with 3 roommates. So we shared a bed. Each of us shared a bedroom. There was 2 people to a bedroom. One of these guys was Colin. He was a sort of a nerdy dude. I think he wasn't in school for animation like I was. I think he was an industrial design major, but he was really nerdy, sort of D&D type comic book anime. He was getting into anime, and I think he was kind of enamored with me. He was a little younger than me. He was maybe a year younger than me, but I was at sort of the pinnacle of my anime fandom at that point. Like, I was going to New York every weekend, scouring Canal Street and Chinatown for like the latest VHS animes that weren't even dubbed yet. Like, I was on a hunt. I was getting all the hot low shit. Like, I was spending a lot of money on anime and manga still, a lot of Japanese market stuff. And he was just getting into anime, and he knew anime from like a very Western sci-fi channel perspective. So he always thought I was the shit because I had the latest stuff, and I would let him borrow it. And again, this was the VHS era. This was probably 95. And I was very cool with him. Like, he was like, "Oh, I want to see Dirty Pair." And I was like, "Dirty Pair, dude, there's a series now called Dirty Pair Flash. Like, it's all Japanese, but if you want to watch it, without the subtitles, you're welcome to borrow it." So he would just come into my room and borrow stuff all the time. No problem. I borrowed an anime from him. I think it was like an FYE copy of Macross Plus or something, like an early dub, an early expensive release. And I borrowed it from him. And I think I took it to Ducky's apartment to watch one night and forgot to bring it home. And he was really upset. Like, "Where's the tape?" And I was like, "Dude, I just left it at Ducky's." Well, don't you know, this motherfucker had his mom corner me the next day. Now, this tape was at Ducky's for like less than 2 days. I just left it there by accident, and be like, "Colin really wants his anime tape back." They were coming to visit for the weekend, his parents. I was like, "Is this guy kidding me?" So from very early on, I have very bad taste in my mouth about it. He was a brat. He was just a brat, this dude. But him and his friends would convene on, let's say, a Friday night in my apartment and play Magic the Gathering. And because of this guy and his association with it, tainted the game for I wouldn't even entertain it.
I understand that. Yeah.
Like, he just put a bad taste in my mouth. Anything he was doing, like, he could have been crocheting. At the table with his friends every Friday. But because it was Magic the Gathering, I would just never give it a chance. I always knew from afar that it was like growing up earlier in the 80s, like this was the new D&D type thing. People would go around, have a campaign. It was card based now, it was a little different, but that's how I thought of it. Just like as an extension of what, my friends and their older brothers were doing in the 80s with D&D. So I missed that whole thing. But I think back to a period of collecting, and again, sort of an era that spoke to me. And I think about this, Kyle. I think about the brilliant, strategic sort of marketing talent and savvy that went into selling things to kids throughout the 80s, where I think the first thing I have to talk about is Wacky Packages, right? Because this was a card collecting thing, clever for a certain, 2 aspects I would say that was clever about. One, they were stickers, and I believe there was a sticker book like the Return of the Jedi sticker book that went along with Wacky Packages, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure I even went in for the sticker book or peeling them off to like decorate your dresser, decorate the side of your TV. You know what I mean? Throw them up on your stereo cabinet, whatever you could decorate with these things. Or you just collect them like cards. Just leave them on the card backs and just have a stack of them in a rubber band, and you collected them. I thought they were really cool because they spoke to the nerdy sort of comic book illustration side, where you just take these famous, iconic packages, cans of dog food, breakfast cereal, whatever it was, and it was just a spoof. It was a parody of the product. you know? So
Yeah, I'm looking at them now.
Swiss Miss would be Swiss Mess. And then there would be an illustration that spoofed the actual product. I don't, again, it's a weird thing to articulate why my generation was so into this stuff. But if I'm remembering correctly, at least from my perspective, Wacky Packages was a thing that came along between things. In other words, I don't remember it being in the same breath as collecting Transformers. I remember it dovetailing between early G.I. Joe 2 Transformers. Like it was like a segue thing that we were collecting. Like there was a void in the thing that we were sort of excited about. And Wacky Packages just filled that niche. It was almost like it seems like it was either luck or strategically launched by these companies in order to get a broad fan base. And I do remember being so excited about these things. And again, that Ice Cream Man dynamic where if you had 25 cents or 50 cents or $1, if it was even that expensive back then, you hit up the Ice Cream Man. Again, you're at the checkout line with your mom in the supermarket. You're at the stationery store, the drugstore. You just grab a pack or two. You know, it's that impulse buy type thing. Beg your mom for it. Oh, just throw it in the cart and hope she doesn't notice. That type of thing.
That old classic.
So fun.
I'm reading about it now. It's interesting. Yeah, 1967 it came out.
They were around a long time.
Yeah, they identify the period of 73 to 75 as being the height of their popularity. And it said it was the best-selling Topps product at that time.
So it was just this thing for my generation. It was just this thing of bringing it back. You're just kind of reintroducing it, you know, giving it some new life. You're getting contemporary products to spoof. So 80s kids know what they're spoofing, right?
Yeah,
it's funny.
There's 79, 80, 82, and 86 they did runs. So yeah, you're probably 80.
So it was 82,
yeah.
Which is the one for my generation, because 86 was that was like a year shy of me picking up the skateboard. But yeah, the 82, and again, this like brilliantly placed into the market to create fanatics at a time where it was between stuff, especially for boys. I remember that appealing to boys, but again, a thing that could appeal to boys and girls, a thing that was nostalgic for probably parents just a little younger than mom and dad. Mom and dad would have probably just missed Wacky Packages, but certainly for the generation of our Aunt Carla, Aunt Joni, Uncle John, Uncle Mike, that would have been perfect, like their generational wheelhouse for early Wacky Packages. And I just remember loving it, dude. And again, it was a thing. It was a cheap thing. It wasn't even like a $3 action figure or something you could consistently get week after week, or get a pack every week, or, you know, 2 packs every couple of weeks, and something you could collect, and something that was a little frustrating that you kept getting the same one over and over again. But again, I remember just trading with my friends. Oh man, I got 3 of these. I got 3 Swiss Messes. Let me give you this one. So, you know, you still need that one. It was just fun.
Yeah,
it was everywhere.
This is
I
cool.
remember
Yeah,
Wacky Packages getting so popular that, you know, at the checkout in the grocery store, with, you know, nestled in with the chocolate bars and the gum and everything, they would just be empty boxes. Like they were so popular. Every kid was hitting up their mom on the way out of King Cullen.
I sent you a link. Do you see it here in the chat?
Oh yeah.
If you click on it, it's apparently that you can mouse over and see, like, if you mouse over them, you can see the ones, and these look like the 82 ones that you might have been familiar with.
This was it. This was it. And you know what's funny? You don't think an 8-year-old kid is going to be savvy about what these are parodying, but I knew, you know, every single one of these. They're brilliantly.
Yeah, these are cool. They must have gotten
colorful. They're a clear, accurate nod to the product, and their quality. Again, Mad Magazine. It's like a collectible form of Mad Magazine illustration. You know, just I wasn't really down for Mad Magazine back then. I kind of missed it, but this was again. I mean, some of these look like Jack Davis illustrations. You know, super interesting.
Yeah, these must have been your ones. They're probably pretty nostalgic. Cool.
And then, you know, that led into Garbage Pail Kids. Same thing, you know, where it was like that was probably 83, holiday 83, a year before you were born, where the Cabbage Patch craze, that fiasco of moms beating each other up in the box stores over, like it was serious. And then kind of coming in, you know what I learned about the Garbage Pail Kids that I never knew? I don't know who the parent company was, but I know Garbage Pail Kids as Coleco, right? Connecticut Leather Company. They at least were involved, but they might have, Cabbage Patch might have been owned by another entity. But I always knew it as Coleco. But
Tops owns it.
Tops owns it. Tops owns Cabbage Patch Kids.
Oh, I'm sorry, Cabbage Patch Kids.
They own Garbage Pail Kids.
Right, yeah, Cabbage.
When Tops went to, let's say, Coleco, or whatever the company was that owned Cabbage Patch, they just wanted to make trading cards of Cabbage Patch Kids, just conventional trading cards, because Cabbage Patch was so popular. Top said, we'll cash in.
Dude, you're right. Coleco did own it and then they sold it to Hasbro, I guess. Oh no, when Coleco went out of business, I guess Hasbro bought it.
Hasbro swallows up every toy company.
So it went to Hasbro, and from Coleco 82 to 88, Hasbro 88 to 94. This is like their roster or whatever. Mattel 94 to 2003, Toys R Us 2003. And then Play Along 2004 to 2011, Jakks Pacific 2011 to 2014, Wicked Cool Toys 2015 to present.
Oh, so not even under Jakks' umbrella. Anyway, that's super interesting. But I was I wasn't surprised, but that was a little bit of trivia that. So Topps went to Coleco and said, we want to make trading cards of Cabbage Patch Kids. It'll be gangbusters. You got to like the most popular kids product on the market. And Coleco's response was, that's way too lowbrow for us. Like, we don't want to do that. And I guess they kind of saw themselves as elevated in the marketplace or artistic in some way. And Topps' response was doing the Garbage Pail Kids as a parody. And there was a lot of legal proceedings and a lot of battling back and forth. I think they had to settle. There was some kind of huge settlement in Coleco's, I guess at that time's favor. But that was the other thing. It was like taking this phenomenon that was largely back then a girl's phenomenon, Cabbage Patch, spinning it and tying it in with the gross out toy phenomenon, which is a big thing back then, and capitalizing on boys fandom. I mean, it was really brilliant from a marketing standpoint, because essentially what you were doing was you were making Cabbage Patch Kids for boys. And that was the other thing, that sort of hard to articulate gross out toy phenomenon of the 80s. I remember Mad Balls, Creepy Crawlers.
Yeah, Creepy Crawler. I had
right. Breath Blasters. There was all these toys that were just designed to be gross out toys. And Garbage Pail, the Garbage Pail Kids came right sort of in the middle of that. And in the middle of that storm, everybody loved it. Everybody loved. You had to have the most gross toy, the most gross out sort of punk rock thing. And again, that was a thing that we collected. We actively would say, I'm not going to get Skittles from the ice cream man. I'm not going to get the strawberry shortcake bar. I'm going to go in for the pack of Garbage Pail Kids. And that was the last thing I ever collected in card form. And that I just remember being really enthusiastic about collecting those. And again, I wonder where mine went, because I had that whole 82 and maybe into the second season too. And maybe even into the third, where it was just brilliant in all ways. If you look back introspectively or retrospectively and look at how brilliant that was, they did 2 of each card. So they could create even more just by changing the name. So same illustration, each illustration had 2 different names to collect. It was just from A to Z, just really, really brilliant, And I'm nostalgic because that was really, Garbage Pail Kids was getting towards the end of my toy collecting, of collecting anything. Because by 85, 86, certainly I would be out, I'd be too old already. So that was the last vestiges. Garbage Pail Kids might have been the last thing I collected as like a little kid back then thing, before we had to grow up. There was that arbitrary rule, man, no more in 6th grade. Like, it's got to be over by
then.
Man,
I was so deep in 6th grade still, it wasn't even funny. Yeah, my friend, that was fun. Is there anything else that you wanted to discuss and bring up before we move out?
No, that was good. That was a good time, fun, man.
Yeah, it was cool to kind of think about those things. I don't think none of them clearly stuck with me very long or meaningfully in a huge way. So it's cool to kind of recollect about those things and think about that. And I really did scratch this memory of me selling my Star Wars collectible card collection to someone for a nominal amount of money, So that's funny. All right, Dag. Well, let's end this episode as we always do with a dad joke then.
All right. So Kyle, I wanted to shout this guy out, Edgar. And he's in touch with me from time to time on, what is he? He's on my Instagram DMs, and he gets in touch now and again. But he sent me 2 jokes, 2 dad joke bangers. So I'm going to read them both for you. First one, just going to tell you straight out. Kyle, my friend couldn't pay his water bill, so I gave him a get well soon card. I like that one, but this is where
That's
I really
high
want
concept.
to
I like
shout
that
out
one.
Edgar.
Yeah.
Because he sent this thing and he said, Dig, this is what I call an uncle joke. And I thought this was really clever. He thinks of an uncle joke as something a dad wouldn't necessarily say to his kids, but an uncle might say it. A little bit inappropriate. And I said, that's a really good idea, an uncle joke. You and I could certainly relate. We have a couple of uncles like that.
Asking us which of the elderly neighbors of our grandmother we would want to sleep with most. Some of them are dead.
Some of them are dead. I think, yeah, all but maybe one has passed.
Is Mary alive? Is Mary alive? Lee's gone, obviously. Ms. Baum's in the great beyond at this point.
She was dead before that game even started.
Oh, I know who you're talking about. I don't want to say.
Yeah.
She's probably still alive. Yeah.
Yeah, I think she would still be rolling. Yeah. Hopefully. Hopefully. Again, we won't name names. All right. So he says this uncle joke. And I said, yeah, uncle joke. I like this. Kyle, what do you call a Norwegian prostitute?
I don't know.
A fjord escort. I don't know. When he sent me that one, I said, you're in.
That's good. That's great. I love that.
Good stuff.
Very well done. All right, my friend. Well, I appreciate your time. Hope all is well in your world. And
super fun.
And yeah, this was a fun one. This was a cool recollection. I think people will like this episode. Thank you all out there for your love, kindness, and support of all things KnockBack and Last Day Media. Couldn't do without you. LastDayMedia.store for merch and patreon.com/lastdaymedia for early ad-free access. We'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye. KnockBack, a retro and nostalgia podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Colin's Last Stand LLC, and is recorded from Central Virginia and the Philadelphia suburbs, USA. The show was conceived by and is produced by me, Colin Moriarty. My co-host is Dagan Moriarty. KnockBack's executive producer is Dustin Furman, and the show is edited by associate producer Ben Smith. All of Last Stand's theme music is by Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand Media's shows, including KnockBack, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. The following names are at the producer support level or higher on Patreon, and we're grateful for your kindness and generosity.